According to the 3,000 years of monetary history we are unpacking in today's deep dive, you're actually just feeling the very predictable tremors of what the source can a stage 3 currency collapse.
Which is profoundly rational anxiety to have,
Uh-huh.
We're heavily conditioned to think of money as something static, a permanent fixture. A dollar's a dollar.
But it's not.
No, it's absolutely not. When you look closely at the mechanics of how that money actually operates, how it's created out of thin air, you start to realize that the grocery store checkout is just a tiny ripple of a massive earthquake happening underground.
Okay, let's unpack this, because this deep dive is, arguably one of the most important we've ever done. We are looking at a stack of sources that map out the mathematical end of our current financial system.
And, crucially, they provide a highly detailed, radically optimistic blueprint for what comes next.
Yes. We're starting with this deeply sobering historical analysis on the 4 stages of global reserve currency collapse. It takes a hard mechanical look at the lifespan of the U.S. petrodollar.
Right, but then we are pairing that with 2 profound texts exploring PROU, which stands for Progressive Utilization Theory.
Originally proposed by the Indian thinker P.R. Sarkar, right?
Exactly. And these texts explain exactly how you, your neighbors, and your local community can build a completely bulletproof financial lifeboat.
The contrast here is just wild. On one hand, we've got this clinical breakdown of how global financial empires mathematically exhaust themselves.
And on the other, a practical guide to reclaiming our economic agency. It moves us past the doom scrolling, essentially.
So to set the mission for our time today, yes, the first part of our conversation is going to deal with the architecture of systemic collapse. We have to look at the structural rot.
Because you have to know why the ship is sinking to know how to build the lifeboat.
Exactly. But the ultimate destination of this deep dive is incredibly hopeful. We are focusing on how local communities, small businesses, and how you listening right now can forge massive resilience.
So let's start with that structural rot. The historical analysis makes a very bold claim here.
Yeah, that what we're seeing isn't an anomaly.
Right.
Right.
It's not just the result of a single bad policy or a recent pandemic. The text argues it's a specific mechanical pattern that repeats roughly every 70 to 80 years.
Like clockwork. A dominant global currency doesn't die overnight. It dies in 4 very specific stages.
Slowly at first, and then all at once. Stage 1 is what the author calls the setup.
Okay, walk us through the setup.
So stage 1 occurs when a dominant power creates a financial system backed by something heavily tangible, like a specific weight of gold or silver.
Or even absolute military dominance over physical trade routes.
Exactly. There is a real, verifiable foundation. The world trusts the currency because that paper represents a legally binding claim on something real.
It's the honeymoon phase. Everyone buys in because the math makes sense. If I have a piece of paper that says I own an ounce of gold and you actually have the gold in a vault, we can do business.
But then, invariably, we hit stage 2, which is expansion.
The empire gets hungry.
It does. It builds vast alliances, it wages foreign wars, funds massive domestic infrastructure, and to do all that simultaneously, it has to take on debt.
I always used to think of this like a Jenga tower. You keep pulling blocks from the bottom to build the top higher.
That's a great visual. Or, as the material suggests, it's like trying to bail water out of a sinking wooden boat, but the bucket you're using is made of the wood you just ripped from the hull.
Wow. Yeah, that perfectly captures it. You fix the immediate problem, but you permanently destroy the structural integrity of the boat, which brings us to stage 3.
Crisis. The hull starts giving way.
Because what happens when the dominant power spends vastly more than it actually produces?
To cover the gap, they start artificially inflating or printing money. They transition from actual strength to the mere perception of strength.
The cracks become visible to everyone else. Rivals emerge. Trust erodes.
And how do dying empires usually respond to that loss of trust?
Almost always with physical force, right? Military interventions, aggressive sanctions.
Yes, but projecting force globally is incredibly expensive. So they spend more capital trying to project the illusion of strength, which forces them to debase their currency even further to pay for it.
It's a self-reinforcing death loop. You print money to fund the military to protect the currency, but the printing destroys the currency you're trying to protect.
Precisely. Which inevitably triggers the final phase, stage 4, abandonment.
The key players just quietly back away.
Exactly. They don't announce a formal boycott. They just start settling trades in different currencies, building alternative clearinghouses, and the dominant currency becomes a historical footnote.
And what makes this analysis so chilling is the historical case studies. This isn't just modern theory. This is played out for 3,000 years. Let's look at ancient Rome.
Right around the 2nd century AD, the Roman denarius was the undisputed reserve currency. Their stage 1.
Backed by real wealth. It was something like 90% silver, right?
Yes. The Roman Empire stretched across 3 continents, and the denarius was the grease that allowed all that cross-border trade to function. You could weigh the coin and know its purchasing power.
But then stage 2 kicks in. Endless frontier skirmishes, dozens of legions demanding constant payment.
And massive administrative bloat back in Rome. They hit a mathematical wall. They didn't have enough silver coming out of the mines, and they couldn't raise taxes without triggering revolts.
So they did the only thing left. They started mechanically debasing the currency.
Literally melting down the existing silver coins, mixing in cheaper base metals like copper or bronze, and reminting a larger quantity of new coins.
Keeping the face value the same, but destroying the intrinsic value.
By the 3rd century AD, the text notes the denarius had gone from 90% silver to less than 5% silver.
Less than 5%. In just about 100 years, they were just ripping wood from the hull to make more buckets.
Which triggers stage 3. Massive spiraling inflation. Ordinary Roman merchants weren't stupid. They saw the new coins were mostly copper.
So they just raised their prices or refused the state currency entirely.
Exactly. Citizens actually bypassed the state apparatus and started bartering with raw, unminted gold directly among themselves, just to survive.
Wait, but the Roman government was an absolute military dictatorship. Couldn't they just point a sword at a merchant and force them to accept the cheap coins?
They tried. Emperor Diocletian issued an edict mandating price ceilings, with the death penalty for anyone who refused the official currency.
Oh, wow. Did it work?
It completely failed. You can threaten a farmer with death, but you can't force him to sell his wheat for copper coins that won't buy him seed for next year. He'll just hide the grain.
You can't legislate trust into existence.
Exactly, which led directly to stage 4, the fragmentation of the Western Empire and the death of the denarius.
Okay, let's fast forward to the 16th and 17th centuries. The Spanish Empire. They had something Rome never dreamed of. They had Potosi.
A mountain in modern-day Bolivia with more easily accessible silver than any civilization had ever controlled.
The text says, between 1500 and 1800, they extracted roughly 40,000 tons of silver.
Yes, which birthed the Spanish real, the famous piece of 8, the world's first truly global reserve currency, an unshakable stage 1 foundation.
But then stage 2 with a vengeance. Endless wars against the Ottoman Empire, the Dutch, the English.
And here, the Spanish case study introduces a fascinating economic mechanism. They suffered from the price revolution. They actually imported catastrophic inflation into their own homeland.
I found this part so counterintuitive when reading the source. How does importing massive amounts of real physical silver hurt your own economy?
Well, money is only valuable relative to the goods it can buy. Spain flooded its market with new silver, but their actual domestic productivity, agriculture, manufacturing, wasn't growing.
So it's like a town where everyone suddenly wins the lottery. Nobody wants to work at the bakery. There are only 10 loaves of bread, so a loaf suddenly costs $1,000.
That's exactly it. Prices skyrocketed, and this triggered a fatal hollowing out of their economy. It became vastly cheaper for Spain to import manufactured goods from rival countries than to produce them at home.
So the domestic industry is just withered away. The silver just flowed right through Spain and landed in foreign bank vaults.
Spain possessed the most nominal wealth, but generated no actual value, which brings us crashing into stage 3, crisis.
Right. 1588, the Spanish Armada is destroyed. And this detail blew my mind. The greatest silver empire in history defaulted on its sovereign debt 4 separate times between 1557 and 1647.
4 sovereign defaults. Because the military required so much capital and their economy produced nothing, they had to borrow from foreign bankers to keep the war machine running.
They had all the money in the world and still went bankrupt. And stage 4 followed predictably. The Dutch guilder replaced the Spanish real.
Spain was reduced to a second-tier power in a single generation. It is terrifying how fast it happens.
Okay, one more historical example before we bring this to the present day, the British pound sterling. This one feels uncomfortably close to home.
It's the closest structural parallel to the United States today. By the mid-19th century, the pound was king. Backed by the gold standard, controlling 40% of global trade, stage 1 was absolute.
And then World War I happens, the ultimate stage 2 overextension.
Britain spent ruinous sums fighting Germany. To fund it, they had to borrow staggering amounts of capital, primarily from private banks in the United States.
So they went from the world's greatest creditor to a massive net debtor overnight. The foundation cracked.
And the fatal blow, as the source points out, wasn't a military defeat, it was financial. The 1956 Suez Crisis.
Let's break down the mechanics there. Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, so Britain, France, and Israel invaded to take it back. A classic imperial flex.
But the U.S., under Eisenhower, was furious. They didn't want a colonial war destabilizing the Middle East, but they didn't send an aircraft carrier to stop Britain.
No, they used a much more lethal weapon. Financial threats.
The Eisenhower administration simply threatened to aggressively sell off massive holdings of British pound sterling bonds on the open global market.
So if you're explaining this to someone who isn't a finance expert, why is selling bonds a lethal threat?
If the U.S. dumped billions of pounds onto the markets, the supply would massively exceed demand. The value of the pound would collapse overnight. Britain wouldn't be able to afford to import food or fuel.
They held a financial gun to the head of the British economy. Withdraw your troops, or we bankrupt your society by morning.
And the British capitulated instantly. In that moment, the entire planet realized where actual power resided: Washington. The pound was finished as the premier reserve currency.
Wow. And the historical analysis points out a vital geographic reality here. Every transition of power was anchored to a specific geographic choke point the empire couldn't control anymore.
For Rome, the Rhine-Danube frontier. For Spain, the Atlantic trade routes. For Britain, the Suez Canal.
Which brings us directly to the core argument about the US dollar today. The source maps this exact 3,000-year-old cycle onto the money in our wallets right now.
And it identifies the specific fatal geographic choke point for the U.S. dollar, the Strait of Hormuz.
Let's trace the U.S. dollar's trajectory. Stage 1 was birthed at the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference, right?
Yes. The U.S. dollar was legally backed by physical gold at $35 an ounce. The U.S. held 2/3 of the world's gold, so it was incredibly stable. Every currency was pegged to the dollar and the dollar to gold.
But then, just like Rome, the U.S. entered a massive Stage 2 expansion in the 1960s.
Escalating the Vietnam War while funding the Great Society domestic programs, they were spending vastly more dollars than they had gold in the vaults.
Writing checks their gold reserves couldn't cash. And foreign governments noticed. France even sent warships to New York to demand their gold.
The drain became a hemorrhage, forcing President Nixon into a corner. In 1971, the Nixon shock, he closed the gold window.
The dollar was suddenly just paper. By all historical metrics, that should have been Stage 4 right there. The dollar should have collapsed.
It absolutely should have, but it didn't because of an audacious geopolitical maneuver by Henry Kissinger in 1974, the birth of the petrodollar system.
A massive protection racket. Saudi Arabia agreed to price all its oil exports exclusively in U.S. dollars. No pounds, no yen, no gold.
In exchange, the U.S. military provided ironclad protection for the Saudi royal family. They replaced gold backing with global energy demand.
Because every industrialized nation needs oil. If the Saudis only accept dollars, every nation has a life-or-death need to constantly acquire U.S. dollars.
They literally engineered artificial global demand for their fiat currency.
But the analysis makes a crucial distinction. The petrodollar isn't backed by physical oil in the ground. It's backed by the U.S. Navy's ability to protect the shipment of that oil.
Which brings us back to the Strait of Hormuz. It's located between Oman and Iran. At its narrowest, it's barely 21 miles wide.
But 20% of the world's daily oil supply flows through it. 1/5 of global energy consumption relies on a 21-mile gap.
The entire petrodollar architecture rests on the assumption that the U.S. military can always guarantee passage through that strait.
So for decades, this worked beautifully. The U.S. could run massive trade deficits, borrow at low interest rates, and the world absorbed the inflation.
But beneath the surface, the Jenga tower was hollowing out. The overextension accumulated at terrifying velocity. Trillions on Iraq, trillions on Afghanistan.
And then the 2008 financial crisis. The Federal Reserve initiated quantitative easing. Let's define that, because it sounds like a massage technique, not a policy.
Right, they don't fire up printing presses.
Yeah.
The Fed simply logs onto a computer and changes the digital numbers in the reserve accounts of major commercial banks.
They type a new balance to buy toxic debt. They are creating digital money out of absolutely nothing.
And the scale is unprecedented. The Fed's balance sheet sat under $1 trillion for the entire history of the U.S. up to 2008. By 2022, it exploded to nearly $9 trillion.
I have to repeat this statistic from the source because it's alarming. The U.S. government accumulated more new debt between 2020 and 2023 than in its entire first 200 years combined.
A vertical, parabolic acceleration of debt, the exact definition of stage 3 crisis. The hull is actively splintering.
And just like Spain and Britain, major global players are quietly organizing their stage 4 exits right now.
China and Russia negotiating energy trades in yuan and rubles. India buying Russian oil in rupees. Brazil and China bypassing the dollar.
Even Saudi Arabia is publicly stating they are open to settling oil in other currencies. And central banks are hoarding physical gold at record levels.
Because they are mathematically positioning themselves for whatever comes after the dollar system collapses.
So let's look at the terminal loop the author outlines. If the Strait of Hormuz is credibly threatened, say, by a swarm of inexpensive drones or sea mines, what happens?
It's an immediate catastrophic cascade. Shipping traffic stops. You lose 20% of the world's daily oil. Prices could rocket to $300 or $400 a barrel overnight.
Which induces massive supply chain shocks and aggressive inflation everywhere. Everything on a truck or ship triples in price.
And the Federal Reserve is trapped in a burning building. They face a binary choice. Option A, raise interest rates drastically to fight inflation.
But because the economy is saturated in debt, higher rates trigger massive bankruptcies and a crushing depression.
Or option B, lower rates and aggressively print trillions to bail out the banking system. But doing so while oil is at $400 a barrel turns high inflation into hyperinflation.
The death loop. If the U.S. military intervenes to clear the strait, it costs trillions. They issue more debt, the Fed prints more money to buy it, debasing the currency further.
Which destroys global confidence in the dollar. Borrowing costs skyrocket, requiring even more money printing to stave off default. Once that velocity is reached, there is no clean exit.
Now, I have to play devil's advocate for the listener. They're thinking, the U.S. military is the most advanced in history.
Yeah.
And our tech AI, semiconductors, that supremacy will save the dollar.
The author addresses that directly. The Romans, Spanish, and British all made the exact same argument about their military invincibility right at their peak.
They weren't wrong about their strength in that moment, but projecting power requires sustainable fiscal capacity.
And the terrifying present-day metric is this. The U.S. currently pays significantly more in annual interest on its national debt than it spends on its entire defense budget.
Wow. When interest payments eclipse military spending, you're in deep trouble.
You cannot project power if your domestic economy is drowning, just servicing the interest of past power projections. And regarding technology, AI and microchips don't natively generate reserve currency demand.
Right, commodity pricing conventions do. Inventing a faster microchip doesn't stop the global energy market from settling trades in a different currency.
Technological innovation and global macroeconomic trust are not the same mechanism.
So this first analysis paints a stark reality. The mathematical ceiling is caving in, which forces an uncomfortable question. Why was the system designed this way? Who benefits from the Jenga tower getting taller?
This is exactly where we transition to the PRU sources. They diagnose the fundamental sickness of the economic system that relies on these exploitative currencies.
They identified this sickness as casino capitalism. I love that term. It perfectly encapsulates the feeling that the modern economy is a rigged game where the house always wins.
And the source points to a specific date when this sickness was violently born, September 24th, 1599.
The formal establishment of the British East India Company. The text argues this was a deeply destructive financial innovation.
Before 1599, commercial enterprises were local guilds or direct partnerships. You pooled resources for a task you were directly involved in.
If you funded a merchant ship, you were standing on the docks. But the East India Company invented the tradable share.
For the first time, ownership was surgically separated from the operations and moral responsibilities of a business. You could own a piece of a fleet exploiting India and never step foot on a boat or see the consequences.
It divorced the investor from the physical and moral reality and unleashed the modern stock market. The East India Company basically became a private military looting a subcontinent just to maximize quarterly returns for anonymous shareholders in London.
And that precise, extractive DNA forms the bedrock of modern casino capitalism. The text explores how modern commercial banks function as casinos, creating what the author calls fictitious money.
We really need to explain this mechanism. To the average person, it sounds like illegal counterfeiting. How do banks legally create fictitious money?
Through the fractional reserve banking system, banks extend massive multi-million-dollar overdrafts or margin loans to incredibly wealthy clients, hedge funds, private equity.
But they don't actually have that cash in a vault.
No. When the bank issues the loan, it simultaneously creates a brand new digital deposit in the client's account. They type new purchasing power into existence.
And what do these ultra-wealthy clients do with this newly typed money? Are they building factories or hiring workers?
Very rarely. Investing in the real physical economy is considered too slow and risky. They use this fictitious money to simply buy existing shares of stock or execute corporate stock buybacks.
Just to aggressively drive the stock price up, pure speculation.
They buy shares, restrict supply, drive the price up, and sell to other speculators using more borrowed fictitious money. As long as the central banks keep rates low, the bubble expands.
It's a closed-loop casino for the ultra-rich. But bubbles always burst. What happens then?
The inflated shares plummet, the speculators can't pay back the massive loans, and those overdrafts turn into toxic bad debt. The banks face insolvency.
And here is the ultimate systemic injustice. The bankers and speculators don't just go bankrupt like a small business owner would.
Absolutely not. The source highlights the grotesque reality of bailouts. Because these banks are too big to fail, the political establishment uses taxpayer funds to recapitalize them.
The profits were entirely privatized among a tiny elite during the boom, but the catastrophic losses are forcefully socialized onto the public during the bust. You and I end up paying for the failed bets of billionaires.
That is the exact definition of a rigged casino. And the PROUT sources scale this critique up globally, connecting it back to the US dollar as the reserve currency.
Because it's not just taxpayers being exploited, it's entire sovereign nations in the global south. The text provides a heartbreaking statistic. Developing countries are drowning in approximately $11 trillion of external sovereign debt.
And they are overwhelmingly forced to borrow that money denominated in US dollars or euros, not their local currencies.
Which creates a terrifying vulnerability. If the Fed raises interest rates to fight domestic inflation or stage 3 scenario, what happens to a country holding dollar-denominated debt?
It's an immediate economic catastrophe. The dollar strengthens against their local currency, and their interest payments on that $11 trillion skyrocket instantly.
Which leads to the tragic reality where developing governments are violently forced by institutions like the IMF to implement brutal austerity. They spend more servicing interests to Western banks than on healthcare or education for their own citizens.
It's modern financial neocolonialism. Decisions made on a computer terminal in New York literally dictate the price of cooking oil in a South American market.
The pipeline continuously elevates power and inequality upward. Poorer nations are trapped exporting cheap raw materials just to avoid defaulting. They can never build sustainable domestic industries.
It is an incredibly grim diagnosis of the status quo.
Okay, here is the pivot. If the foundational math of the reserve currency is doomed and the global casino is inescapable, how do we actually escape? What does the progressive lifeboat look like?
This is where Progressive Utilization Theory, or PRUTs, comes into sharp focus. It's not just a theoretical critique, it's a highly detailed, extremely practical, mechanical solution.
It's a ground-up revolution instead of top-down management.
Precisely. And the foundational concept of this entire progressive vision is a socioeconomic structure called the samaj.
Let's clearly define what a samaj is. It's not just giving more power to your city council.
No, it's absolutely not an arbitrary political boundary drawn by a conquering king. A samaj is a defined, cohesive socioeconomic region anchored in shared cultural history, geography, and ecology.
The source gives vivid examples. Imagine a coastal samaj. Their economy is built around deep-sea fishing, tidal energy, marine biotechnology.
Contrast that with an inland agrarian samaj located hundreds of miles away. Their economy is built on agriculture, soil restoration, grain milling. Their needs are fundamentally different.
Because they share similar economic potential, they should be governed as a cohesive economic unit. The text notes PROU analysts have identified 44 such distinct units in India alone.
A samaj is fundamentally organized around maximum self-sufficiency within a familiar, manageable territory, bringing the scale of human life back down to a level people can actually comprehend and manage.
And within this samaj, PRU proposes a radically different system called economic democracy. The text quotes P.R. Sarkar. People must have the right to decide what to produce, how to produce, and for whom to produce.
Under casino capitalism, distant hedge fund managers make those decisions based on profit. Economic democracy demands those decisions are made locally, based on the actual well-being of the community.
To make this work, PRU outlines a specific three-tiered economy. Let's break down the mechanics. Who owns the massive power plant in my town under this system?
The first tier involves key, massive industries. Energy grids, public transit, raw material extraction. Because they are so vital, they are managed directly by regional public authorities and, crucially, run on a strict no-profit, no-loss basis.
So they operate like a true public utility. Their purpose is to provide cheap electricity, not generate dividends for private shareholders to buy yachts.
Exactly. The second tier involves mid-level industries. Large-scale agriculture, manufacturing. These are legally structured and run as worker or producer cooperatives.
Explain how a worker cooperative functions compared to a traditional corporation.
In a traditional corporation, capital owns labor. If you buy 51% of shares, you dictate everything. In a PROUT cooperative, labor employs capital. Absolute democratic control. One member, one vote.
The workers own the enterprise. They elect management, decide how to distribute surplus wealth.
The profit motive exists, but it's subordinated to the well-being of the community. And the third tier is small businesses, family-run shops, independent artisans. These remain privately held in a lightly regulated local market.
But here is the revolutionary regulation governing all of this, neutralizing the toxic legacy of the East India Company. PROUT heavily restricts and often entirely bans speculative, tradable corporate shares.
It requires a paradigm shift in how we view capital formation. PROUT argues you don't need parasitic speculation to build complex things. Capital is raised through public utility banks based on community need.
And cooperatives can issue non-voting investment certificates to community members for a fixed return, right?
Yes, but you cannot buy those certificates, hold them for a week, and sell them at a massive markup. You eliminate the secondary market and high-frequency trading.
If you invest locally, your return is tied directly to the physical success of that enterprise in your community. Imagine an economy that asks, do we have enough nutritious food, before asking, what is the Dow Jones doing today?
But this raises a profound logistical question. To truly insulate a samaj from the collapse of the U.S. petrodollar, it cannot rely on using the U.S. dollar as its medium of exchange.
Right. If you use their money, you're trapped playing by their rules, which leads to the next massive pillar, samaj-wise central banks.
The source sets up a sharp contrast here. Right now, more than 50 major global monetary authorities are aggressively exploring central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs, govcoins.
They offer instant digital payments and lower costs, but the PROU analysis fiercely warns about the dystopian danger of centralizing that much power.
It is the ultimate surveillance tool. If a massive national government controls a programmable digital currency, they have the absolute power to instantly monitor every purchase.
And more chillingly, they can instantly penalize, freeze, or erase the financial assets of dissenting individuals with a single keystroke.
In stark contrast, PRU proposes decentralized samaj-wise central banks. Regional monetary authorities focus relentlessly on local jobs, housing, and agriculture.
They issue their own regional currency. The text suggests calling them samaj coins, circulating alongside whatever national money remains, serving specific local needs.
And what's truly revolutionary is the governance. First, absolute transparency. Everyone in the samaj has the right to see the bank's ledger.
And the board of directors isn't a secret cabal of Wall Street insiders. The text suggests a strict rotation of power. 40% democratically elected leaders from local cooperatives, 20% local labor unions, 20% municipal government, and 20% technical specialists.
And professional corporate lobbying is completely legally banned. This diverse governance ensures credit flows exactly where the community actually needs it most.
If the council decides they need drought-resistant agricultural cooperatives this year, the regional bank provides low or zero interest loans directly to those projects.
The money creation serves the public good, not private speculation. Sarkar laid down a fundamental law of economics. To achieve genuine socioeconomic development, you absolutely must prevent the outflow of money from one region to another.
If your capital is constantly draining out to pay dividends to massive multinational shareholders, the per capita income of your citizens can mathematically never sustainably rise.
The samaj-wise central bank acts as an impermeable firewall. The wealth created stays locked within the community, rapidly circulating. Only highly processed surpluses are exported, and only after local foundational needs are met.
Okay, pressure testing logistics again. An inland samaj growing wheat might desperately need advanced solar panels produced by a coastal samaj. How do they trade without falling back into using a global fiat currency?
This is perhaps the most brilliant feature of the PROUT model. The ultimate defense mechanism is the establishment of networks for inter-samaj barter.
Now, when people hear barter, they picture trading 3 live chickens for leather boots. Horses at the border, but that's not it at all.
Not at all. We are talking about highly advanced modern digital barter, transparent digital ledgers, and sophisticated regional clearing mechanisms. Interestingly, this echoes a proposal made by British economist John Maynard Keynes at the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference.
Wait, really? Keynes proposed a global barter system?
Yes, the International Clearing Union. The core was a neutral accounting unit called the bank core. It wasn't a physical coin, just an internal accounting mechanism to balance trade without exchanging gold or dollars.
And the U.S. rejected it because they wanted the dollar to be king. But PROUT adapts this concept for trade between localized samajas. Walk us through the mechanics.
Let's say Samaj A, an inland region, has a $10 million surplus of grain. Samaj B, a coastal region, produces advanced solar panels. Samaj A exports the grain to Samaj B.
But Samaj B doesn't pay with U.S. dollars or take on predatory debt.
Exactly. The transaction is simply recorded on a shared, transparent digital ledger between the two central banks. Samaj A's account is credited with neutral barter credits.
It's just a mathematical accounting unit acknowledging value provided, not a speculative currency.
Then Samaj A uses those credits to import the equivalent value of solar panels from Samaj B. The ledger balances out to zero. No hard global currency, no parasitic interest, no crushing external debt.
And the rules are strict. You only trade true processed surpluses. You don't export food if your citizens are hungry. Ledgers are strictly reset regularly, so no region accumulates massive permanent debt.
And every trade must prioritize ecological and cultural compatibility.
Skeptics will say this sounds like a utopian sci-fi novel, but the source provides a phenomenal, heavily documented historical example of this, saving millions of lives. Argentina in 2001 and 2002.
It's a vital case study. Argentina experienced a catastrophic Stage 3 collapse. They defaulted on their debt, the peso collapsed, and the dollar-based economy froze. Banks locked their doors.
People had skills and food, but no credible money to facilitate trade. But they didn't wait for an IMF bailout.
They engaged in massive community self-organization. They formed local barter clubs and created their own physical paper trade unit of account called the Credito.
The scale is what makes it so important. Over 3 million people actively participating across more than 8,000 specific geographic locations or nodes.
They printed Credito vouchers with anti-counterfeiting stamps and set up massive markets, trading fresh food, clothing, medical services, plumbing repairs.
All bypassing the collapsed casino entirely. It's undeniable proof that when the top-down currency system fails, localized barter and community credit networks can keep a complex society functioning and fed.
Think about the immense bulletproof resilience of that system. If the Strait of Hormuz closes tomorrow and the petrodollar death loop accelerates, what happens to a Samaj?
A region with cooperative banks and digital barter networks barely blinks at the global chaos. Their supply chains are local, credit is locally controlled. They've built an impermeable firewall against global financial panic.
Which brings us to the tactical playbook. How do we start building this today? The text insists we shouldn't wait for the Jenga tower to collapse.
Right. The transition steps are practical and legal right now. The first step for communities is conceptual. Start aggressively mapping your own region as a proto-samaj.
Identify your shared cultural strengths, ecosystems, watersheds, and existing trade capacities. You don't need permission from Washington to think regionally.
Then convene community councils. Bring together leaders of worker cooperatives, credit unions, labor unions, local governments. Start collaboratively drafting long-term plans.
And pilot the barter systems immediately. Start small to prove the concept. A local agricultural cooperative could trade produce directly to a local green energy provider for solar installation using a closed digital ledger.
Simultaneously, push for reforms in state and local banking laws to privilege community cooperative banks. Push for taxes on speculative financial flows like absentee corporate landlords.
But if you're just an individual, small business owner, or a freelancer listening right now, the advice is to take immediate, highly localized action. Find and join an existing local currency or community barter network in your area.
If you run a local coffee shop or plumbing business, Make the decision today to accept local barter credits for a certain percentage of your goods. You're building a parallel, loyal customer base.
Audit your supply chains. Keep them hyper-local. Move your money out of mega banks and into a local credit union. Support worker cooperative.
Every dollar spent locally is a concrete step toward economic democracy. We have to treat these local initiatives as active laboratories, track the data, how it improves local employment, and builds genuine social resilience.
The overarching message is profoundly empowering. By consciously localizing economic power, communities can forge an impenetrable shield.
It's about reclaiming our agency. We don't have to be terrified victims waiting for the collapse. To make this world a better place for all to live with happiness and justice, know more about PROUT, Progressive Utilization Theory, join the PROUT Study Circle, and also join our YouTube channel, Vipra's Movement.
It's an urgent invitation to stop looking up at the teetering Jenga tower in fear and start looking around at your neighbors to see what foundation you can build together right now.
What an incredible journey we've been on in this deep dive. Just to synthesize, we started with the mathematical reality of global reserve currencies, Rome debasing the denarius, Spain defaulting, Britain losing the pound, and the precarious position of the U.S. petrodollar balanced on a 21-mile geographic choke point.
We diagnosed the disease, casino capitalism, a system born in 1599 that divorces ownership from moral responsibility, inflates asset bubbles with fictitious money, and violently socializes the losses.
Then the brilliant pivot to PROUT, the samaj redrawing borders around ecology and community. Economic democracy prioritizing public utilities and worker co-ops, strictly banning speculative trading.
We contrasted authoritarian central bank digital currencies with democratic, locally focused, samaj-wise central banks.
And finally, the ultimate firewall, high-tech digital inter-samaj barter, keeping capital locked locally, bypassing the fiat debt trap, proven by Argentina's Credito saving millions of lives.
It's a comprehensive blueprint. But as we close, there is one final staggering implication we haven't explicitly stated yet, but logically follows everything we've discussed.
Oh, lay it on me. Give me the final thought.
If these progressive ideas take root, if regions successfully establish sovereign samaj autonomy, manage decentralized central banks without inflation, and seamlessly trade globally using borderless digital barter networks without a hard fiat currency, does the traditional rigid nation-state eventually become completely obsolete?
Oh, wow.
Nation-states derive their coercive power from their monopoly on currency creation and federal taxes. If money and community care become truly decentralized and hyper-local, the massive federal apparatus might simply lose its primary function. Perhaps borders don't dissolve through violent wars, but peacefully through simple economic irrelevance.
That is an absolutely staggering, beautiful thought to leave on, that by taking proactive, cooperative control of our local economies, we might accidentally evolve past the concept of the warring nation-state entirely.
It changes the entire horizon of what is possible.
It absolutely does. Thank you all so much for joining us on this incredible deep dive. The next time you go to the grocery store, don't just feel the anxiety of the collapsing system. Look at the economy in your neighborhood with fresh, empowered eyes. Look for the local cooperatives, seek out local supply chains, find the proto-samajas waiting to be built by people exactly like you.
Yes.
The future is localized, it's cooperative, and the blueprints are in your hands. Catch you next time.